Hello, everyone. Today is Saturday, September 5th, 2020. I'm Bob Diebold, Vice Chairman of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. Today, we continue with Phase 8 and the 44th webinar in our series of webinars on the topic, Comparing and Contrasting the True Teachings of Jesus with the Traditional Tenets and Practices of Organized Institutional Christianity. This is topic 8 in the study guide called Revelation Revealed. Neil Waldrop is the author and the chairman of the committee. I'm turning this webinar over to Neil now. Neil, over to you.
Thank you, Bob. Here we are at the beginning of September, just before the American holiday called Labor Day. And we are indeed continuing our series. We are at an inflection point, a switch of gears that I will explain shortly. But I would state to viewers who may not have been following our series that you would benefit very substantially by downloading the underlying document that we are going to discuss. Actually, it is the major document, Revelation Revealed, that I wrote in the summer of 2016. And you could download it from the website of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. The citation is as follows: www.globalendeavor.net. I say again, www.globalendeavor.net. In this citation, the expression global endeavor is treated as if it were a single word without any space or punctuation in the middle. The link from which you could download the document Revelation Revealed is about 2/3 of the way down the homepage that I have just given you. In addition, if you wish more information about our discussion today and our future intensive discussion of monasticism, the same website also has a document called Questions on Monasticism, and that document of questions appears on the website immediately beneath the link for Revelation Revealed. The questions are intensive. We will not actually reach them today. We will talk about several segments from part 4 of the Urantia book that I think will be a good introduction to the overall topic of monasticism. In any case, we will start in the substantive part with a single paragraph on monasticism that appears on page 109 and the top of page 110 of our document, Revelation Revealed. Now, because you will not have the opportunity to ask us questions as we are going along, we offer you the option of sending us in a question or two by email. If you wish to do that, you would use the email address identified at the bottom of the homepage of the website that I already gave you. But the email address is quite simple. It is info@globalendeavor.net. If you send us a question and we decide to use it in a future broadcast, we reserve the right to edit the wording. And if we do use it, then you would get an answer from everyone participating on that day, not just from me personally. So now I would like to introduce the substantive part of our discussion today. As I mentioned, we will be discussing monasticism. I will start by reading the one paragraph on monasticism that begins near the bottom of page 109 of Revelation Revealed. And then we will proceed to segments from part 4 of the Urantia book that I believe will be useful in providing a general introduction to subsequent detailed consideration of monasticism. Now, this reflects the fact that when I contemplated our return to the document Revelation Revealed and looked at the paragraph on monasticism, I realized that it is much too short and much too limited to serve as the basis for intensive discussion in this group. Therefore, I began quite a bit of background reading that I conducted for several months. Now, what I found, however, is that the topic of monasticism involves an enormous amount of information. It actually covers a period of 1,200 years, from approximately the year 300 CE to approximately approximately the year 1500 CE. It was not possible to deal with this in a very brief form, and I ended up excerpting quite a few documents that I compiled. In doing that, however, I realized that even though I had omitted necessarily a great deal of the detail that I had found by reading, it was still too much to expect my colleagues in this program to be able to read all of it and absorb all of it. So I decided to make those documents available as background information that they are free to consult, but proceed on the basis of questions that do contain quite a bit of excerpts from the documents on the basis that they will be able to answer these questions largely by relying on the background information contained in the document of questions. There are a few questions at the end in which that will not be possible, specifically questions 29 through 37. Now, the documents that I assembled can be downloaded, and the document that I mentioned, the questions on monasticism, identifies the location on my Google Drive from which those who wish could download a zip file that contains all these documents. That's purely up to you. We will not reach that level of detail today. So as an introduction now, I will proceed to read the one paragraph on monasticism that appears in the main document, Revelation Revealed. It begins near the bottom of page 109. E, monasticism. The special roles and prestige associated with monks and nuns were a key feature of Christianity for over 1,000 years, but these convictions and practices have declined in relative importance since the 16th century, i.e., since the Reformation. Most Protestant denominations do not make any provision for monks or nuns, but the Anglican Episcopal Church does and is therefore an exception. The initial and most fundamental concept of monasticism was to separate oneself from society and live in relative isolation, implicitly concentrating on one's own spiritual advancement rather than the progressive growth and development of humanity. In the centuries that followed the year 1000, however, the members of new religious orders sought to serve individuals and groups in society by various different methods, e.g., preaching, teaching, ministering to the sick, and assisting persons who are impoverished or otherwise in difficulty. So even though there are quite a few ideas in that single paragraph, it is not a suitable vehicle for detailed discussion. Today, to the contrary, I will stimulate discussion of 4 documents consisting of passages from the Urantia book that I have assembled as a device that will provide a certain amount of background reflection for which we can build our subsequent detailed discussion of monasticism. The first of these documents comes from paper 136. It is section 6 of that paper, and it is entitled The Second Decision. The paper itself is called Baptism in the 40 Days. Bob, I would ask you now to put that document, paper 136, section 6, on the screen for us, please.
Neil, let me know if it's there.
Yes, I have it. I hope that it's equally visible to the other participants. Marvin, would you be able to read us the first paragraph that begins with having settled his policy? This, of course, is about Jesus during the 40 days.
Sure, be glad to, Neil.
Thank you.
The second decision. Having settled his policy concerning all personalities of all classes of his created intelligences, so far as this could be determined in view of the inherent potential of his new status of divinity, Jesus now turned his thoughts toward himself. What would he, now the fully self-conscious creator of all things and beings existent in this universe, do with these creator prerogatives in the recurring life situations which would immediately confront him when he returned to Galilee to resume his work among men? In fact, already, and right where he was in these lonely hills, had this problem forcibly presented itself in the matter of obtaining food. By the third day of his solitary meditations, the human body grew hungry. Should he go in quest of food as any ordinary man would? Or should he merely exercise his normal creative powers and produce suitable bodily nourishment ready at hand? And this great decision of the master has been portrayed to you as a temptation, as a challenge by supposed enemies that he, quote, command that these stones become loaves of bread, close quote.
Thank you. I'd like to stop for discussion of this, Bob, but yes, please take it off the screen. This paragraph, to me, it implicitly has to do with the reality of special spiritual powers as opposed to the normal circumstances of human life, wherein Jesus decided that he would continue to be subject to these normal procedures and would not go beyond them. Now, in a way, this contrasts with what happened later in the history of Christianity, whereby there was an effort to draw on spiritual power, to create political power, to create influence, to show the sponsorship of God in the organized institutional movement that eventually became called as Christianity. So I wonder, Andre, if you could comment on this paragraph and by implication, what it establishes for the purposes of the organized religion that did not quite follow the example that Jesus presents.
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, what occurs to me immediately is simply the idea that there is a value in sticking to the powers and prerogatives of the order in which you find yourself. Jesus had chosen to live as a man among men, and it would have been outside of the norm for him to have been using his creative powers to self-nourish. Now, this is a problem that a creator son doesn't have. They are self-rejuvenators, as is stated in the Urantia book. But for the purposes of his bestowal, it would have flown in the face of what his entire intention was, and that was to experience to the full what it means to be a human being. Up to that point in his life, he had not done so. In fact, the reason he was at this point, a point which a human being normally wouldn't achieve unless they had aligned their will so closely with God's and gone through the rest of all the progressive mandates that are necessary to achieve fusion with their thought adjuster, which would, remove them from the planet. Well, he had complied with everything up to that point. For what purpose would it be that he should stop complying with that now? In other words, he indicated that there was a great good to be living humbly as a man still. on this world. And so he chose to do it. I don't know if that gets to everything in your question, but he finds himself, the 40 days period is interesting. We all will go through it eventually in our lives, whether, tomorrow or in several hundred years. And it really is a mandatory period of virtual monastic sequestration. And he chose to go through it as a normal human being.
Thank you. I think you've given us a very good transition to further elements of this problem. He went through it as a normal human being while accepting and reinforcing the dimensions of circumstances that a human being faces. Whereas over a period of several centuries, his successors in the spiritual movement that became called Christianity used what they claimed to be their spiritual authority to exert power and influence and domination over others. In other words, they did not remain satisfied with the normal course of human beings. They leveraged the spiritual power and influence that they believed they had received from him, Jesus, in order to exert authority over others. George, what would you say about that? Was this simply a logical conclusion of the human temptation to exert power, even though Jesus had decided not to exert power?
Oh, well, certainly humans like to exert power, at least most of us. Yeah, the whole issue of superhuman powers, to put it that way. I mean, he decided not to, and he explained why he decided not to. Yes, it was to lead a normal human life that people on this planet and other planets could understand, but it was also because miracle seeking is a primitive feature of religion, and he did not want to promote that sort of attitude in his teachings. Nevertheless, I mean, it's I guess it's built into our nature to want miracles or to have powers that let us escape certain circumstances or to gain power or for other reasons. So I mean, it's why Christianity put such a focus on the resurrection, because that was miraculous. The idea that Jesus is the incarnated Son of God is a miraculous idea, but it's not something that anybody witnessed per se. I mean, yes, Gabriel appeared to Mary, but that was secondhand. Whereas the resurrection, hundreds of people saw him after his crucifixion. So that was as far as human beings are concerned, that was a real miracle. And that became very much a center part of a central aspect of Christianity. That was the proof that it was real, which is understandable, but that's not what Jesus was trying to teach.
Katharina, I would like you to consider the question of selfishness here. In effect, Jesus's decision was a repudiation of selfishness. He was not going to derive any power or influence for himself by exerting his special powers as a creator's son. Would you say that this question of unselfishness did or did not get passed along to his followers?
Well, I think to say first, I don't think it got transported to his followers unless for a very few people, but certainly not in the movement of monasticism. And I think the question of distinguishing between honest human self-care and self-importance. I mean, Jesus understood that he had to feed his human body through means of the world and not just by some magic intervention, right? But he never moved into self-importance. And I think that's what the followers didn't understand. And I think to this day, to distinguish between self-care, self-acceptance, self-love, and self-importance is quite a challenge for most people, because most fall into self-importance and excuse all sorts of behavior. But what I thought was really interesting is, as you read the intro article on monasticism and how blatantly it almost opposes Jesus Christ's way of being in the world. When I was reading it and thinking about it, I sort of reframed it that in their best intentions, you know, when they secluded themselves to have permanent vacation with God, in their honest attempt, it was probably individually striving to attain the fruits of the Spirit as they are mentioned in paper 34, section 6, love, joy, peace, long-suffering, etc. And then in a later phase that you described later, as however the members of new religious orders sought to serve individuals, was an attempt to move towards attaining the fruits of the divine spirit in paper 193, section 2, right? Loving service, unselfish devotion, courageous loyalty, and so forth. And I saw monasticism moving into that direction, attempting towards attaining more the divine fruits of the Spirit. However, it was not taking the next step, i.e., to turn them into the fruits of divinity, which are also talked about in the Urantia book, when the fruits of the Spirit, of the divine spirit, are socially applied and embodied for the greater good of most people. And we are far away from that. But I saw sort of monasticism painted in this framework, for better or worse. But I would think there was a lot of honest attempt towards what I just was saying. But I think coming back to Jesus's self-care versus self-importance, he is, to me, the prime example of human humility, you know. And yeah, that's what I can say right now.
Okay, thank you. Bob, I would like to turn back to the document, and in doing that, I would request that you read the next paragraph beginning, Jesus then settled upon. And after you read it, please comment on the idea of natural laws and the cosmic dimensions that Jesus wished to respect and what that implies. So if you could please begin by reading the paragraph.
Okay, is it visible on the screen?
Yes, it looks good. Thank you.
Okay. Jesus thus settled upon another and consistent policy for the remainder of his earth labors. As far as his personal necessities were concerned, and in general, even in his relations with other personalities, he now deliberately chose to pursue the path of normal earthly existence. He definitely decided against a policy which would transcend, violate, or outrage his own established natural laws. But he could not promise himself, as he had already been warned by his personalized adjuster, that these natural laws might not, in certain conceivable circumstances, be greatly accelerated. In principle, Jesus decided that his life work should be organized and prosecuted in accordance with natural law and in harmony with the existing social organization. The master thereby chose a program of living which was equivalent of deciding against miracles and wonders. Again, he decided in favor of, quote, Father's will. Again, he surrendered everything into the hands of his paradise Father. The focus of what you want me to comment on, Neil, is
the dimensions of natural law, the cosmic arrangements of matter, mind, and spirit that were the context in a cosmic sense of Jesus's bestowal on Urantia. And that, as this paragraph said, he decided to observe rather than depart from.
Well, natural laws, of course, are physics. We're dealing with material areas here. So what I think the most of this basic initial discussion on this has been, and what was actually embellished here in this particular paragraph was that based upon time, natural law would not be abrogated. And I think that was explained fairly well at the wedding ceremony when Jesus, had the emotional thought that met the Father's will, where his mother was pleading with him to, turn the water into wine, or I'm not sure she said turn water into wine, but she said, we need more wine. And when it became his desire, emotional desire, he didn't even realize it, of course. There was no abrogation of a natural law. It was just accelerated in that time. So this is where the description of how all that could possibly occur, and there was a good use case there, turning the water and having the water being turned into wine. So I see natural law as being that which we as humans are subject to. And in fact, another point to make here, and I think it says it a little later in the same section here, is that Jesus was living his life not just for Urantians, but also for his far-flung universe, meaning that, and of course we're speculating, and we've done this before in some of the webinars, that potentially there were broadcasts, or could be broadcasts, or magisterial sons or teacher sons on various other planets in Nebadon, in Michael's vast universe, would also understand and also have this same description of what the second decision was. And that, even if you look at the death on the cross, he didn't save himself. There is a great lesson here, I think, to be understood, and that is to live your life as it is. Deal with the vicissitudes of being human. And I see his giving in to or his desire to live with natural law. And of course, we see the miracle. We see the miracles, even though he decided not to do miracles. Miracles create issues, like the feeding of the 5,000. Most of the 5,000 didn't understand didn't even want the gospel message. They just wanted food. And he told the apostles a little bit later, you can see that this is not really something that we should be doing. I'm paraphrasing, of course. So I hope that got to the heart of your question here. So I'll turn it back to you and see what else we can talk about here.
Thank you, Marvin. I would like to return to the group context in regard to this decision. Jesus, as the incarnated bestowal son, effectively decided that he was living his life in the cosmic context of creation and a material world which had descended from his own plans as the creator son of that universe and that world, that he would not depart from the normal procedures, that he would be subject to the environmental circumstances and indeed the existing social organization, as it states in part of this context. Now, what I would like to ask you about is why his followers believed that they were masters of all of the above and had every right to manipulate the environment to their advantage, sometimes by spiritual methods, otherwise, in other cases, perhaps by political methods.
Well, you know, I've been thinking, you'll pardon me, Neil, I've been thinking along some different lines related to monasticism. Would you mind? I don't really have much in the way of thought in regard to his followers and immediately in relation to your question, but I do have.
All right, can you give me a general preview of where you want to head? Because I have to manage this discussion for
Sure.
purposes.
Sure.
Go ahead.
It does relate to the general conversation of depending on miraculous means versus the everyday exigencies, limitations of human life in relation to monasticism.
Fine. Go ahead then, please.
Yeah, what's really interesting to me, and I tend to come at these kinds of questions as more a social scientist background, with that background. And so when I look at what happened in the first 1,000 years and then progressively from 1,000 on through the 1200s, early Renaissance days, when I look at it sociologically and historically and economically as economic structures that were extant, and I look at the role that the monastics played in society during that whole time, the Dark Ages. I don't see the monastics as a power class. I really saw the polity of the church and the polity of the kings and feudal lords as the power class. And the monastics were, in a sense, the worker bees under the religious power structure of the Catholic Church, and the political rulers of the Catholic Church, who were not monastics really at all, by and large. They were political players, big time political players and power players. And so the situation for the first 1,000 years and into the 12 and 1300s even, the monastics were the only educated class. They were where education was lodged, because no one could survive in that society as merely an educated person. They were all scrabbling just to basically survive. And so the power structure of the church created this enclave and these worker bees really that served their purposes. And also they were to some extent an independent third arena sociologically, meant to pursue the spiritual life, but also to be academics, to keep the scrolls, to keep the traditions. And nowhere else in society was that really going on. They were the seed form of universities. So it's a very interesting institution. And they could not have survived except had they been set apart by a power structure and supported for that educational purpose. So that's very interesting to me going forward. The one other thought is, so both education and the inner spiritual pursuit were segmented into that part of society, and that's the only place where they were really largely happening. When the printing press occurred and with the Black Death, the sociological structure was radically changed. People began being educated, and the ability to become an educated person and even pursue the spiritual pursuits of the gospel began to be possible for laity. And that gave rise to the circumstances that resulted in the Reformation. and the destruction of the power structure because of the Black Death that killed everybody indiscriminately. A third of European population was killed. So that's what to me led up to the death of monasticism as such a powerful institution, is changes in education, changes in power structures. And the one last thought I'm hoping we'll get to in later parts of our conversation about monasticism is when you look at the remnants of the monastic orders in the modern day, you see people like Thomas Merton, Thomas Keating, and more recently Richard Rohr. Modern day monastics have taken this forward and basically said, not only is education universally a right and available, but the spiritual pursuit of relationship with God for the individual and spiritual growth is a universal mandate for all human beings. And we are here to serve that need, not to be a sequestered community that are the privileged ones to pursue it. So you'll pardon me, it's sort of in a sociological, economic, and political view of some of these phenomena.
Marvin, on the one hand, thank you. On the other hand, you have in effect done a leapfrog onto quite a bit of the discussion that we will have in detail later. And it's okay, but it far goes beyond the immediate focus that I was trying to promote. And I'm not surprised, frankly. My experience with all of you colleagues is that I never can quite anticipate where you will go with any particular point, and you have indeed epitomized that in these reactions. I would say that from the perspective of spiritual power, the monastic approach proclaimed that the prayers of monks and the accumulated merit that they amassed by these prayers were extremely influential in resolving the anger of God and resolving the problem of guilt and forgiveness. And so this was the philosophic or theological method in which they exerted power. They exerted power over the consequences of sin from their perspective. George, I wonder if we could get first Bob to turn to the next page and then ask you to read the first 3 paragraphs on the next page. It begins Jesus' human nature all the way through the paragraph that says his superhuman power. Yes, that will still fit here. That's good. So if you could read those 3 paragraphs for us, please.
Sure. Jesus' human nature dictated that the first duty was self-preservation. That is the normal attitude of the natural man on the worlds of time and space, and it is therefore a legitimate reaction of a Urantia mortal. But Jesus was not concerned merely with this world and its creatures. He was living a life designed to instruct and inspire the manifold creatures of a far-flung universe. Before his baptismal illumination, he had lived in perfect submission to the will and guidance of his heavenly Father. He emphatically decided to continue on in just such implicit mortal dependence on the Father's will. He proposed to follow the unnatural course. He decided not to seek self-preservation. He chose to go on pursuing the policy of refusing to defend himself. He formulated his conclusions in the words of Scripture familiar to his human mind. Men shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. In reaching this conclusion in regard to the appetite of the physical nature, as expressed in hunger for food, the Son of Man made his final declaration concerning all other urges of the flesh and the natural impulses of human nature. His superhuman power he might possibly use for others, but for himself never. And he pursued this policy consistently to the very end. When it was jeeringly said of him, he saved others, himself he cannot save, because he would not.
Thank you. Andre, I would like to go back to one of the themes that we partly discussed before, that this example of Jesus refusing to use his supernatural power to benefit himself contrasted with the predilections of the subsequent hierarchical church to use a great deal of power for its own benefit, to amass influence, to amass wealth. Why did the organized church, in effect, not adopt the same policy that Jesus did of refraining from using supernatural power to benefit itself?
Well, far be it for me to wonder and second guess what the church might have been thinking, but I'll take a stab at it. Jesus somehow understood that power was not the be all and the end all. Jesus somehow understood that power was in the service of something higher, and that to amass power for its own sake, or to have it, was not in and of itself a great good. And so my thinking leans quite simply to the venal nature of humanity, and especially unspiritualized humanity. We know that the apostles were not able to catch up to Jesus' spirituality, despite long years of teaching. They did get more with the spirit of truth, but somehow they never got to the point where they were able to say fully appreciate everything the master had taught, much less so the church. The problem with amassing power is that it becomes its own attraction. It becomes its own motive force. And it's clear that, one just has to look at history and how that power was used. And the fact that people lived in fear of what the church taught and what the church could do, that you have the kinds of phenomena on the one hand of the Inquisitions that happened throughout history, and you had on the other hand the ability to marshal for centuries a campaign like the Crusades. Now that may seem far afield, but all I'm trying to do is to illustrate that the church didn't come anywhere close to what Jesus was able to do. And the reason they didn't, they did not have a clear view of the human Jesus, let alone the divine Jesus. I mean, they didn't have a real idea of what his human incarnation was about and why it was that he lived as humbly as he did.
Thank you. Katharina, I'd like just to pursue this slightly. The attitude and example of Jesus basically was that he would not seek power for itself. He would not exert power for itself. He would not seek personal advantage. And Andre has explained that these were not principles that were fully honored, to say the very least, by the organized institutional church that tended to amass power and influence. Is there something that I am missing in their understanding of Jesus's teachings? Did they not accept the idea that the mission of the church was to perpetuate and promote Jesus's idea of a personal relationship with God rather than their own power and influence?
I do think that the message of Jesus was incredibly radical, and not in the sense of political terms. I mean, to uproot, turn upside down the notion of a wrathful God, a vengeful God, to a God of love and mercy. To uproot the notion that we are all endowed with God's presence. So the notion of God immanent and not just eminent. I think that was such a huge step. Tremendous upheaval. And I think humanity was not ready. A humanity who waits for miracles, to sort of the magic wands to create a new situation, to experience something different, but then to right away turn back to old behaviors. And I think there was also not enough understanding how ingrained notions of original sin and unworthiness were, and how to work through this, to embrace, to know the kingdom within. I think, and then as this was not present within the collective of at the time, and practically to this time to a great extent, it was very easy for some who had glimpses or wanted to search to impose power of how you get to the divine. And so I think that's where my understanding of our evolution comes. It is such, to this moment, a radical step. I mean, having grown up Catholic and got into the echelons of Catholic education, the human Jesus is not a reality. And the love of that he brought to this planet in that kind of teaching and thinking is an abstract love that has nothing to do with everyday life. And so I see the failure of us as humanity to fully understand, embrace, and embody Jesus's teachings. And unless we go deep, really deep within ourselves and uproot the programming and the judgments against self and others, we will not be able to walk that path that Jesus walked.
Thank you. If I could comment briefly on what you've just said, it seems that you are confirming an insight that many people have shared, whereby the values of the institution as a structure, in effect, overcame the spiritual values of personal ministry and teaching. And the people in the institution, in effect, became focused on not only themselves, but also on the power and authority that the institution could wield. Is that, I see you nodding, so I will take that as accepting my general summary of your remarks. Bob, I'm sorry, go ahead. You want to react?
I think what I would, in a nutshell, say is only changed people can change the environment. And unless this, and this is why I think a religion, a personal religion and relationship with God is so crucial to understand and to live. That's the only way we will collectively move forwards towards light and life, you know.
Thank you. Bob, I would like to continue on with the next segment and ask you to read it for us. Since you are in charge of the screen, you will find it easier to make this adjustment, because I have in mind a substantial segment of this, several paragraphs. The rest of page 2, the Jews were expecting Jesus sorrowed for his people, and then 2 more paragraphs on the next page, he was not a Messiah, and in this decision. So if you could read those 4 paragraphs for us, please.
Had to unmute. Is it visible? I just want to make sure because
Yes, it's fine. And then you will, of course, move the screen as you are required to do in order to continue with all 4 paragraphs.
4 paragraphs. The Jews were expecting a Messiah who would do even greater wonders than Moses, who was reputed to have brought forth water from the rock in a desert place and to have fed their forefathers with manna in the wilderness. Jesus knew the sort of Messiah his compatriots expected, and he had all the powers and prerogatives to measure up to their most sanguine expectations. But he decided against such a magnificent program of power and glory. Jesus looked upon a course of expected miracle working as a harking back to the olden days of ignorant magic and the degraded practices of the savage medicine men. Possibly for the salvation of his creatures, he might accelerate natural law, but to transcend his own laws, either for the benefit of himself or the overawing of his fellow men, he would not do. That he would not do. And the master's decision was final. Jesus sorrowed for his people. He fully understood how they had been led up to the expectation of the coming Messiah, the time when, quote, the earth will yield its fruits 10,000-fold, and on one vine there will be 1,000 branches. And each branch will produce 1,000 clusters, and each cluster will produce 1,000 grapes, and each grape will produce a gallon of wine, unquote. The Jews believed the Messiah would usher in an era of miraculous plenty. The Hebrews had long been nurtured on traditions of miracles and legends of wonders. He was not a Messiah coming to multiply bread and wine. He came not to minister to temporal needs only. He came to reveal his Father in heaven to his children on earth, while he sought to lead his earth children to join him in a sincere effort, so to live as to do the will of the Father in heaven. Neil, you've got on mute. There
Okay,
you go.
thank you. I would like you to follow up with this in terms of the underlying implications. Why was this expectation of wonder so deeply ingrained in the Hebrew psychology, the psychology of the Jewish people?
Well, I think we had a little, a little instance of it earlier, and I think that in the beginning paragraph here, when going back to the supposed miracles of Moses, humanity was primitive in these days, and in fact, magic and the supernatural were basically unknown. Science hadn't even come close to evolving yet. The Greeks had the closest thing to science, at the time. Certainly wasn't in the Bedouin vernacular or concept that anything but supernatural or magic could be performed by individuals who had these special powers. And you see this in all cultures. You see it with the all primitive type cultures have these special individuals who can bring forth the supernatural to heal people, to do things. So that's not surprising, I don't think. And Jesus must have known, well, certainly he knew. And, I still have to think that you can't lose the fact that while the midwayers are speaking to us here, because they're perceiving what Jesus did and telling us what their perception is for us to evaluate. I got thinking about that in the last 2 paragraphs there, that at the same time, this way of living, this philosophy of living that Jesus decided to do, to take not abrogate the natural laws, his natural laws in Nebuchadnezzar, was something that almost was a paradox. And I wanted to make a point of that, something that Katharina said, that humanity was not ready. And in fact, Jesus taught in paradoxes. So I think that the fact that he chose to go to the natural law and to live his life with the philosophy of natural law, what was interesting was what was George had read, about taking the unnatural way, that he wasn't going to do self-preservation. He wasn't going to do that. And the paradox is seen in that statement that was read, that man does not live by bread alone. And I think that that's, as Katharina said, humanity wasn't ready, and only began to be ready, maybe potentially, after the Renaissance. To be honest with you, that's the way I see this. And this whole idea of overawing is still part of our society today. I mean, we still have saints, and we still have these medicine men type individuals who we call priests today, who are the folks that are supposed to be able to be the intercessories to God. So I'll leave it at that at this moment, and hopefully I've gotten to the gist of what you're asking now.
Thank you. I would like to pursue this with George in the direction of the fact that the Old Testament scriptures recorded many of these supposed miracles on behalf of the Hebrew people. One could say, perhaps with a degree of flatness, that many of the stories of the Old Testament amounted to a kind of nationalistic propaganda on behalf of the Hebrew people, or their conviction of their role. And the fact that, for example, the story of Moses is leading the Israelites out of Egypt included the idea that God had rolled back the Red Sea for them to pass through. Now, what I'd like to do, George, obviously, is not to pursue any of those individual stories, but to talk about the consequences of adoption by the Protestant reformers of the tradition that the Bible was inerrant and infallible and included all these miracles, so that, in effect, spirit is in charge of humanity, spirit is in charge of material life, as well as, shall we say, the spiritual elements of life.
Could you repeat that question? I'm not sure what you're going for here.
I'm not sure I can. In the Protestant Reformation, the teaching became that the Bible was perfect and inerrant. And the Bible included all these stories about miracles whereby God had intervened on behalf of the Hebrew people. So what I'm asking you is whether this reverence for the Bible, including all these stories, implicitly conveyed a conviction that God would manipulate reality on behalf of his followers and believers.
Well, I mean, it's always been a tenet of theism, which both Judaism and Christianity are, that God intervenes in history. He intervenes in the world. He acts in the world. He creates the world. He controls it. He upholds it. I mean, those are basic tenets of at least these two religions. I'm not so sure about others, but Judaism and Christianity essentially assert that God, who is spirit, intercedes in the material world. So, and not to put too fine a point on it, but the Urantia book says the same thing. So it's not such a stretch for me to see how people would associate supposed exercises of spiritual power as evidence of God's favor. Right. So it doesn't address your question about the inerrancy of the Bible. That's something that came later. I mean, the Bible wasn't even canonized until for hundreds of years after Jesus. So, I mean, that's a whole different issue. Although Jesus did talk about how the Jews considered the Torah and their other books to be infallible, and he had that discussion with Nathaniel, saying, these are high spiritual thoughts of spiritual individuals, but it's not the infallible word of God. So I'm not I'm not sure exactly where this idea of infallibility came from. If it was something just created on the spot by the Protestants, or if it had a deeper history going back, I don't know.
Well, thank you. I will try to contribute to that last thought of yours by referring to part of the explanation that Salonia provides, that at the time of Jesus, or the contemporary, this is a statement in paper 74, section 8, paragraph 11, that the contemporary Hebrews of about 500 BC considered these writings to be divine, did not consider these writings to be divine revelations. They looked upon them much as later peoples regarded mythological narratives. And then in the next paragraph, Salonia uses the phrase, this spurious document. So that the way that this document became accepted as verbatim, inerrant, infallible is a complicated question that I can't address, but it is clear that the view of what these narratives meant shifted over time, and that even in Jesus's day, they were not considered to be factual narratives, whereas later interpretation, especially after the Protestant Reformation, turned these narratives into presumed facts, and that engendered quite a bit of theological conundrums. Gentlemen and lady, I can't say ladies and gentlemen because we have one lady and a variety of gentlemen, but anyway, I would like to conclude this discussion of this one document so that we can go on to the next one, which I think is at least equally important. And I propose to do that by reading the final 3 paragraphs myself. Bob, you can put them up on the screen. In this decision, Jesus of Nazareth portrayed to an onlooking universe the folly and sin of prostituting divine talents and God-given abilities for personal aggrandizement or for purely selfish gain and glorification. That was the sin of Lucifer and Caligastia. This great decision of Jesus portrays dramatically the truth that selfish satisfaction and sensuous gratification alone and of themselves are not able to confer happiness upon evolving human beings. There are higher values in mortal existence, intellectual mastery and spiritual achievement, which far transcend the necessary gratification of man's purely physical appetites and urges. Man's natural endowment of talent and ability should be chiefly devoted to the development and ennoblement of his higher powers of mind and spirit. Jesus thus revealed to the creatures of his universe the technique of the new and better way, the higher moral values of existence, the higher moral values of living, and the deeper spiritual satisfactions of evolutionary human existence on the worlds of space. I don't know what happened, Bob. You shifted over to another document and then it became, it overlapped what I was reading, but I was reading it from my own screen. So in any case, the point here has to do with not using power for oneself. And the authors, the midwayers, compare this as a lesson that Lucifer and Caligastia had violated. They were using spiritual power and authority for their own benefit, whereas Jesus obviously repudiated that. I would like now to shift to the next document, document A02, which is paper 195, section 4, the European Dark Ages. Andre, would you be available to read? Wait a minute, what happened to Andre? Yes, he's there, good. Would you be available to read the first 2 paragraphs, please?
Yes, I would.
Good, thank you.
I'll read it off the screen as mine is under all these other PDFs. The church, being an adjunct to society and the ally of politics, was doomed to share in the intellectual and spiritual decline of the so-called European Dark Ages. During this time, religion became more and more monasticized, asceticized, and legalized. In a spiritual sense, Christianity was hibernating. Throughout this period, there existed alongside the slumbering and secularized religion a continuous stream of mysticism, a fantastic spiritual experience bordering on unreality, and philosophically akin to pantheism. During these dark and despairing centuries, religion became virtually second-handed again. The individual was almost lost before the overshadowing authority, tradition, and dictation of the church. A new spiritual menace arose in the creation of a galaxy of saints who were assumed to have special influence at the divine courts, and who therefore, if effectively appealed to, would be able to intercede in man's behalf before the gods. But Christianity was sufficiently
I'm sorry,
socialized.
I would like you to pause because there's quite a lot in these two paragraphs.
There are.
Yeah. And as the entry point for future discussion that will involve your other colleagues, I would like you to take just that one sentence that I've highlighted in the first paragraph. During this time, religion became more and more monasticized, asceticized, and legalized. Please comment on the implication of this trio of past participles: monasticized, asceticized, and legalized. Does it seem to you that the midwayers are expressing, shall we say, a disagreement or a distaste for all of that?
Well, I would agree with your assessment of their opinion, in that they're highlighting this as you are. But I'm also going to pretend that I'm not out of my depth in commenting on this. So what I would say is, from my own experience, is I grew up as a Roman Catholic, and as a result of that, you know, I was shown basically, because in the 60s there were still plenty of examples of people that believed that if they lived more of an ascetic life or a monastic life, that there was something inherently good about that. And that if they held to the rules as they were presented, that somehow this was also better. Rules, of course, as the church had interpreted those rules. I don't have much more to comment on that other than to say that this was an unnecessary burden on people. It clearly falsified what spiritual growth was really all about and what really would foster spiritual growth. And so young men like me at age 13 were seriously considering becoming priests. And thankfully, I was disabused of that at age 14 by, among other things, too many individuals that were moving away from the church, and therefore I didn't see why I should be hanging around either. That was part of it. It was pretty base in that sense, but there was also the element of hearing the priests speak about the lack of donations in the collection plate about every second Sunday. And this became a detractor to a young man who had seen up to that point his future in the Catholic Church. I'm forever grateful for having been disabused of that, because it led me to the Urantia book just a few years later.
Thank you. I would like to turn to an idea in the second paragraph that Andre read. Marvin, would you please comment on the idea of a galaxy of saints who were assumed to have special influence? What did this betoken in your view? You're muted at the moment.
Sorry. In responding to your question, I want to go back to something Katerina said in the last round, and which I've been thinking about since. And for me, it relates to the question of where is spiritual power lodged? Where do we access spiritual reality in order to have our lives transformed? And I think Jesus was unequivocal. He said, you have to lodge it in your relationship with God. And that was a radical proposition back at that time. The scribes and Pharisees said, follow us and you've accessed spiritual power because we're the ones with spiritual power. The early apostles really lost the essence of the gospel when they said, lodge your dependence on the person of Jesus Christ and his resurrection and you'll have spiritual power. That's how you access spiritual life, even just simply a nominal acceptance of Jesus. And then the church arose and really replaced the scribes and Pharisees and said, believe in the church, the body of Christ, believe in our power, obey our commands, and you'll find the locus of spiritual power that wherewith you can change your lives. And the monastics went in search of a solitary lifestyle bereft of any connection to material life and tried to find the source of spiritual power. And when I look at our current day, there's variations in our movement. Read the Urantia book and you've found the source of spiritual power. And I agree with Katerina, the tendency in human nature is to resist what Jesus was saying, which is really devote yourself to this interior relationship with God, live a full life of service, engaged in life and in your relationships with other people and in the world, but primarily rooting your sourcing of spiritual power in the interior relationship with God. And therein lies the path forward. Therein lies the way that Jesus was showing us. And the vast majority of people are looking for a simpler solution, a more superficial solution. And it simply won't get them there. And in Protestantism for several hundred years, it's been simply read the Bible. And you've accessed the locus of spiritual power. So, and until larger numbers of people will really accept what Jesus said and say, go within and really live this spiritual life seriously, we're going to wallow around in one or another form of idolatry, whether it's church idolatry or bibliolatry or Urantiology or this ology or that ology. They're all shortcuts that won't get us to where Jesus was saying we want to go. So, I think the endeavor on our part is to try and point people to that true path and say, come with us on this journey of exploration that is a unique adventure for each one of us, and whet people's appetite for the availability of that possibility and to encourage them to gird their loins and move forward in that fashion. Take it seriously. So, pardon the soapbox, but and that's what I heard Katerina basically saying. For a long time to come, we are going to be in an uphill battle trying to interest people and show them that this is the way forward and interest enough of them to take the spiritual life seriously.
Thank you. I would now like to turn to Katerina, who indeed has volunteered. I would point out that apart from her concerns about being able to participate in this webinar effectively, she already has a reward in that Marvin has just stated 15 minutes later that he was still thinking about something you said, which was, I think, a very nice compliment. But I would like you, Katerina, perhaps to address the point about the saints and why the saints became such a psychologically appealing figure for centuries and centuries. But if you have something else you want to contribute, go ahead, and I will pursue the idea of saints with someone else.
No, I think that I like the expression, the galaxy of saints. And I think when you somehow, I cannot get out of my head that there is some intended purpose to cut the direct line to God of individuals off. And even if some at the time of Jesus understood that that might be the path, the tremendous responsibility of free will and walking that path of communion with God, it's an arduous path in our evolution. And I think, so to create this need of intermediaries, which those San Antonio, San this, San that, San Pedro, all of them, right, kept people sort of in bondage. And you gave them sort of these little figures that would interject their needs towards God or Christ or whatever. And I think it's a powerful instrument to keep people in bondage and in fear. And what my own personal journey through Catholicism and searching for God and lessons in life has shown me that until you really know who you are deep inside, you can be misguided, manipulated, deterred. And so people who know who they are have no more fear. You cannot mess with them. Doesn't matter what's going to happen, how they're going to be approached. And I think just helping people, encourage them to go onto that path, to know who they really are, and through whatever means, right? God is immense. The Spirit of truth is here for everyone. And so I think the galaxy of saints, although they may have brought a lot of comfort, and I have quite some icons of different relics of my Catholic upbringing, and they're just a reminder, you know. They bring in part some beauty and some sense of history, and a reminder of going inward in and grow your soul and know who you are. So I don't know. I remember my mom always praying to San Antonio when something got lost, and you know, and then it was found thanks to San Antonio or Saint Anthony in English. So that's my spiel on the galaxy of saints, the intermediaries. And maybe they are, you know, it was necessary. Yeah, it was probably a necessary step for humanity.
Thank you. I recall a previous webinar in which Bob and I explored remarks about the statue of Saint Christopher that was on the dashboard of someone driving a car and was supposedly going to protect them from an accident. One may wonder whether this was the statue or whether it was the saint, and whether Christopher was part of this galaxy and so on. But Bob, if you can reconstruct that thought, I wonder whether, in your view, this expression of interest in St. Christopher's perception had to do with the idea that he, St. Christopher, would protect you, whereas God was not going to do that.
That's a great question. What I was going to talk about was the galaxy of saints here. So I thank you, Katharina, for pointing to that. One thing I want to mention in the first paragraph, though, is this word fantastic, which is in front of spiritual experience. Fantastic has two definitions. And of course, the second definition is fanciful or remote from reality. And just for the record, I want to say that what the Midwayers are telling us here in that particular sentence is that a continuous stream of mysticism, a fantastic spiritual experience bordering on unreality. So what we have here, before we get to the saints then, is this monasticism, asceticism, and legalization, which is pure secularization of spiritual. And in fact, what the Midwayers say is a new spiritual menace arose in this galaxy of saints. We don't quite know what spirit is. We know it's we know it's an energy. We know it's a domain of reality. It's used as an adjective. It's a noun, and I think that as we study more of this, I'm starting to get a better perspective of what spirit might be. We can like gravity, we can see the results of it, the fruits of the spirit, so to speak. What I was going to say about the saints, though, is that it seems to me that as science was becoming more known, after the Renaissance, and certainly after 1500 or so, or 1550, when Gutenberg got the printing press going, and then society became a little bit more informed of things, that astrology was the mode of choice for causality. One of the things that to me seems as a major theme in this whole cosmic picture that the Revelation shows is that process is something that we need to understand and really consider. What's the process between how the thought adjuster and the mortal mind create the soul? There's certainly a process there, and I brought this up a number of times. But I think what the saints did, and why I think that the Midwayers called this a spiritual menace arose, is because if you think about astrology, it's a process-oriented thing. When Mars is in the seventh heaven and Venus is in the wrong place, it will affect the way that we operate on the planet. It's a retrogression, for example, and bad things are going to happen. So this idea of saints is no different than that. Certainly in my mind, I see that the process is involved is the same as we put the statue, the icon of Saint Christopher up on the car dash, and we're driving 80 miles an hour on a crowded highway without any seat belts in the 1950s. Didn't reduce our risk, that's for sure.
But could you try the twist that I gave you? Was this because Saint Christopher was going to be more effective in protecting you than God himself?
Well, that's a great question. I was going to get to that here. We talked a little bit about deism and theism earlier, and that was in the 18th century, that was the big differentiation between the founding fathers. Many were deists and some were theists. The deist says that God created all of this and he stepped back and he lets it fly. And theism says that he puts his hand in there and he, for whatever relativity anyone thinks in their theistic thoughts, he does things. I think what Catholicism tried to do was to buffer that a little bit with these saints. And that, I think, is a cognitive dissonance. And in fact, to me, sitting in a high school religion class created such a cognitive dissonance. And I think it does with most individuals, to try to figure out what's really going on here. What is the process involved with what the saint actually does? So what I'm saying is I can't really answer it, but it does create a spiritual menace, I think, is a pretty good way to call it. So I commend the Midwayers for calling it that. Back over to you.
Thank you, George. I would like to probe just a bit on the first two sentences of that same paragraph, the second paragraph that Andre read. During these dark and despairing centuries, religion became virtually second-handed again. The individual was almost lost before the overshadowing authority, tradition, and dictation of the church. Now, everything being comparative, I think it is fair to say that the authority to tradition and dictation of the church were at least diminished by the effect of the Protestant Reformation for Protestants. But there was nevertheless still an emphasis on certain creeds and traditions that had to be observed even in that faith. So would you say that finally, at this point, the year 2000, that Christians in general, or most of them, have gotten away from the idea of a second-handed relationship, that they accept and agree that they should have a direct relationship with God?
I don't know enough Christians to answer that question.
All right.
I don't know. I think it's probably true. I mean, I remember, what was it, back in the 70s and 80s, I forget. But anyway, yeah, I mean, the Catholic Church, the Protestant Church really doesn't have any authority over anything. You know, it's whatever the pastor can persuade you of. And more often than not, they're more interested in recruiting you for their particular political affiliation than telling you how to get to God. That's kind of not a nice thing to say, but Catholicism, I think, has lost a lot of its influence for lots of reasons, which I don't think we need to go into here. There have been a lot of scandals over the years, and I think that's really, really damaged, their brand.
Okay, well, in an earlier interchange, Andre commented that in his youthful experience, he was depressed at the constant request for contributions that he heard in almost every service that he attended. And so perhaps this is indeed an illustration of the point that Katharina made earlier, an effort to institutionalize and apply the benefit of the spiritual authority for oneself, or at least for one's group. Marvin, you have emphasized consistently over the course of many webinars a very valid point about personal relationship to God. Are you content with the problem highlighted in this first sentence, virtually second-handed, has been overcome, or is it still an issue?
Oh, I think it's still an issue. And it's related to the question I think you asked George, which did he think that most Christians are maybe ready for the personal, more the emphasis on personal religious experience? I think I keep thinking about this. The book makes the statement, and this was back in the 1930s when this statement was made, that most Christians are unwitting secularists. That's such an interesting statement, and the best I can make of it, and I still think the case is accurate today. At least this has been my experience in churches, that there's a very superficial level of engagement, and it's like, let well enough alone. It's, this suffices. I've checked my box on religion, and it's not a very deep engagement. And so that to me is unwitting secularism. It's basically, I live my life as a secularist, not really in active engagement with God moment to moment, day in, day out. And I think increasingly what characterizes our day and age is that more and more people are actually hungry for the real spiritual life, but they really don't know where to go to find it. They go to churches and they either find far right ideologies and almost religious zealotry around a doctrine that doesn't bring them into very active engagement, keeps them actively engaged, but more ideologically. And in the mainline churches, there's relative lack of engagement by and large. In the contemplative arenas and in the interfaith arenas, I think people are finding that level of engagement, but I think many people are searching with no idea where to find it. And I think there's tremendous opportunity to share the possibilities of that relationship and even methodologies of how to approach it that flow from this revelation. But I don't think turning people onto the Urantia book accomplishes it. I think there's still just as much search for that within the Urantia movement that I've seen out in general. So I think the endeavor to artistically work with the treasures of this revelation in ways that reach out to people, touch them, and help them find a way forward into that living relationship remains a challenge in our day and age. And the audience for it, I think, is vast if we can figure out how to artistically, culturally engage them with that purpose.
Thank you. I would like to move on to the next paragraph that reads, but Christianity was sufficiently socialized. Bob, could you put that on the screen? And Andre, would you do us the favor of reading it, after which I will ask you, Andre, a particular question about part of that paragraph.
Sure, and I can get started now. But Christianity was sufficiently socialized and paganized that while it was impotent to stay the oncoming dark ages, it was the better prepared to survive this long period of moral darkness and spiritual stagnation. And it did persist on through the long night of Western civilization and was still functioning as a moral influence in the world when the Renaissance dawned. The rehabilitation of Christianity following the passing of the Dark Ages resulted in bringing into existence numerous sects of the Christian teachings, beliefs suited to special intellectual, emotional, and spiritual types of human personality. And many of these special Christian groups or religious families still persist at the time of the making of this presentation.
Thank you, Andre. Now, I would like to probe the second half of that paragraph, because the tradition in conventional analysis of Christianity is to focus on theology, spiritual principles, shall we say. Whereas in the second half of this paragraph, the Midweir Commission seems to be associating different varieties of the Christian tradition with psychology, with intellectual, emotional, and spiritual types of human personality. How do you react to that? Does this largely coincide with our discussion that we had last week about the importance of mind and the influence of mind on belief?
Well, it certainly coincides with the statement that the study of your religion is theology, the study of another's is psychology. And evidently they're studying others' religion. And so they bring it up in a psychological sense. And to me, that makes sense in the sense of how religions have started to look after a study of the Urantia revelation and its treatise on some of the other religions, especially the evolution of religion. And what strikes me, has struck me about not only Christianity, but whether you look at Islam, whether you look at Buddhism, whether you look at any number of different sects in these religions, you'll find that there are some that are definitely more of an intellectual bent. Some are more of an emotional bent. And I don't know exactly what they're referring to when they're talking about spiritual types human personality, but that certainly has piqued my interest. But certainly, when you look at Islam and you compare, for instance, Sunni and Shia Islam, which really are both two different philosophies, one which is more person-centric, Shia Islam is definitely more person-centric, even though they both hinge on Muhammad. On Muhammad, Shia Islam has that extra phase of hinging on how the 12 imams evolved out of that whole thing, and that's caused a problem ever since. But then you have the Sufis, which represent this whole charismatic movement, this desire for mysticism, this desire for relationship with God in a very emotional sense. You look at Christianity and you see similar kinds of evolutions. I don't know how I would characterize, for instance, the difference in Western versus Eastern Orthodox versus Western Latin Christianity, but you see the arising of even charismatic movements within certainly Western Christianity. There was a new charismatic movement back in the 70s and 80s that was taking hold even at that time. And that's how that strikes me, is that we can look at that. I mean, each type of human personality is going to look in their own particular way for some kind of religious practice that suits them. And if it's not met by the sect that they grow up in, they will seek it somewhere else, so long as they're not afraid of the consequences of leaving that sect. Hence, you have some sects that will go out and kill adherents who leave those sects, such as in Islam.
Thank you. Katharina, I would like to revert to approximately the same question that I asked Andre. I'm still inquiring about the association of different sects of the Christian teachings with intellectual, emotional, and spiritual types rather than with theology. What do you make of this?
I don't think I have enough qualifying background to answer this in depth. What comes is that maybe these different strands evolve based on types of human personalities and the need, and thus they are born out of being a more hands, emotion kind of person, intellectual kind of person. And maybe there was a need to reach different types of personalities. And you see that, I mean, in any religious movements, you have those who perceive, understand, pray, worship in a similar way, being clustered and finding each other. So I don't have a good historic understanding of these different types, but maybe it just serves different types of human personalities. That's sort of off the cuff an answer.
Well, that's fine. And I don't expect anyone to have a decisive response to this. I was curious about the differentiation in this paragraph, in the sense that the tradition in Christianity, and I think in other religions, has been to emphasize theological premises and to talk about different beliefs as the dividing line that separates one sect or one variation of a particular religion from another. Whereas the Midway Commission in this section does not say that. It does not focus on theological beliefs. It focuses on types of people in intellectual, emotional, and spiritual terms. And so this is interesting, at least to me, because it correlates with our discussion last week of the influence of mind and mindal characteristics on belief. So I regard this as an additional illustration of that point that we primarily discussed last week. Bob, could I draw upon your reading again in order to conclude this segment? The Christianity exhibits all the way through the next paragraph, religion is now confronted.
Sure. Christianity exhibits a history of having originated out of the unintended transformation of the religion of Jesus into a religion about Jesus. It further presents the history of having experienced Hellenization, paganization, secularization, institutionalization, intellectual deterioration, spiritual decadence, moral hibernation, threatened extinction, later rejuvenation, fragmentation, and more recent relative rehabilitation. Such a pedigree is indicative of inherent vitality and the possession of vast recuperative resources. And this same Christianity is now present in the civilized world of Occidental peoples and stands face to face with a struggle for existence, which is even more ominous than those eventful crises which have characterized its past battles for dominance. Religion is now confronted by the challenge of the new age of scientific minds and materialistic tendencies. In this gigantic struggle between the secular and the spiritual, the religion of Jesus will eventually triumph.
Thank you, Bob. If I could hold you on tap for a short period. I'm especially interested in the final paragraph that you just read, the challenge of a new age of scientific minds and materialistic tendencies. And then the Midway Commission states that in this gigantic struggle, the religion of Jesus will eventually triumph. Now, looking at the world outside, not confining ourselves to readers of the Urantia book, do you see signs of this triumph, or are we still confronted by the reality of scientific minds and materialistic tendencies as being the predominant characteristic of most human beings in the Western world?
Wow, a loaded question for me to put on video here.
All right.
I was about to say it's really hard to make a clear judgment here, but I do believe that because of the ubiquitousness of information, at least, not necessarily knowledge, but of information, we're seeing another type of a renaissance. You know, I thought about what they said in the paragraph in front of that. Let me just go back. That Christianity persisted through the long night of Western civilization and was still functioning as a moral influence when the Renaissance dawned. Well, the Renaissance, of course, was ostensibly between 1400 and 1600, which puts it right, which puts the Gutenberg press right in between there. So obviously there was some prelude to the press, being or being able to develop in European society that level of ubiquitous information. And that's when art started flourishing, economics changed, because the humans at that time, I think, were able to cross-pollinate thoughts. Well, where we are today is almost in a cacophony of information. And I think we're going through the chaotic eddy like you would do under, a Mach 2 plane situation where, you get the chaos, and then as soon as you pass through that particular stage of chaos, you've got level flying. And I think a similar thing is happening today with that. So the So the vitality and the pedigree that they're talking about in here, and they did use large words, a gigantic. Um, the Midwayers don't spare some of the things, and even the word ominous. That's a fairly strong word, also, of those eventful crises. So they're telling us that maybe we're, sensing by the middle of the 19th century, I'm sorry, of the 20th century, that it sure stands that this ubiquitousness of science, secularization, is going to come face to face with the religion of Jesus. Over to you.
Thank you, George. I'd like to pursue the same question with you that I asked Bob. You have commented about the value of science and the recalibration of belief in the context of destroying previous superstitions. But now in this sentence, we also have materialistic tendencies. Are you content with the conclusion that the Midway Commission expresses that the religion of Jesus will eventually triumph?
Yes.
Okay, you want to elaborate? I made the mistake of asking you a yes and no question.
That's maybe the first time. Yeah, it has to triumph because I can't remember which paper it is, but it's pretty apparent to all of us that Western civilization is kind of crumbling. It's kind of coming apart at the seams. I mean, it has been for a long time. And so, I don't think personally it's going to be that much longer before things become disorganized enough that people will stop paying attention to their iPhones and start wondering about what the future holds. In other words, as I see it, we live in a society that's just nothing but a series of distractions. It's almost reached the point where people don't have to worry about food or shelter. Yeah, they just spend all of their time entertaining themselves, distracting themselves. And that's, if you, I remember reading a review of the Rise and Fall of Rome, and that's what happened at the end of the Roman Empire. We haven't lasted 1,000 years, but things move faster now. And, towards the end, everybody was just spending all of their time in diversions of one form or another. There was no serious interest in things beyond the immediate pleasures of the individual. So, I think we're approaching a point where, Jesus said, how can you progress in the spirit if you don't spend any time contemplating eternal realities? And that's pretty much in a nutshell what I see the problem now. For a lot of people, even reading something like the Urantia book seems utterly, why would you read about something that isn't going to happen for 1 trillion years? Talk about being unrelated to your immediate needs and desires on this planet. The Urantia book is pretty far out there, to speak. So, but I think as things become more disorganized, people will begin to start paying a little bit more attention to things to what comes afterward. They'll start to maybe contemplate a little bit more eternal realities.
Well, let me follow up with you in regard to a phrase that you just tossed off, immediate needs and desires. Is your view that I think you ended up with that finally people will come to understand that their immediate needs and desires are not the sole point of life?
They'll reach the point where after a while, it all gets dull and meaningless. You only have to read history. to know that, this sort of overindulgence in distractions, amusements, games, and et cetera, eventually just wears thin. At the end of the Roman Empire, you couldn't find anything entertaining enough to keep people quiet, and they just started tearing things down. The whole civilization just collapsed because everybody was just doing their own little thing, and nobody could even think, a year ahead to what their civic obligations were. But, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you, lady and gentlemen. I will now confess to you that I'm surprised at the relative pace with which we have discussed these very interesting topics. I have to tell you that I was wondering before our meeting began whether there would be enough material here to to fill up 2 hours. And it's very clear that we have enough material, much more than that. But I would like to skip around a little bit. Bob, could you put up?
Dale,
Yes.
I did have a comment in relation to the recent conversation.
Okay, fine. Go ahead.
About our current times, we've been speaking about the deterioration of different centers of power historically, whether it's the church or science, as giving guidance for people in modern times as to how they live their lives and find coherence and much less satisfaction. And there's this paragraph, which I think speaks which we're very familiar with, quite cogently to the current situation. 9946. During the psychologically unsettled times of the 20th century, amid the economic upheavals, the moral crosscurrents, and the sociologic riptides of the cyclonic transitions of a scientific era, thousands upon thousands of men and women have become humanly dislocated. They are anxious, restless, fearful, uncertain, and unsettled. As never before in the world's history, that's an interesting statement, as never before in the world's history, they need the consolation and stabilization of sound religion. In the face of unprecedented scientific achievement and mechanical development, there is spiritual stagnation and philosophic chaos. The term for our modern era in some sense is a postmodern era, where it's all value relativistic and there are no absolute locations for truth and value and guidance. And I think that paragraph, where literally millions of people are floating out on the seas of relativism and not in a happy state. I think they're hungry for a sense of coherence and a sense of nurture and sustenance for themselves, personally, spiritually. And they look at the institutions they used to trust and they don't trust them anymore. They're overwhelmed by information overload and value relativism. And I think in those, but their needs remain the same. Their deep personal needs for orientation. And so I think the fields are increasingly ripe for the real religion of Jesus, because that's what offers resolution to that set of problems.
Marvin, I'm very pleased with your statements, and I agree with the desirability. I hope that you're right about the timeline, although it's very difficult to appraise because different people are in different phases of their lives and different levels of consciousness. But we know that this transition needs to happen. And in effect, the Midwear Commission's final remarks state that it will happen. We simply do not know when. Well, I was starting to say that I need to skip around in order to cover some of the important points in the amount of time we have left. Bob, I would ask you to put up segment 4, A04, if you could, please. And then I will simply ask someone to read the first item in A04.
Give me 1 second. I didn't have that one up. 2 seconds here, should have it.
I've got it.
Aha, I think I have a volunteer to read that first paragraph even before Bob can put it on the screen. How are you doing, Bob?
Okay, it'll be up in 1 second here. Let me just share the screen. Should have it now.
Thank you. This paragraph has an immediate application to what happened in regard to monasticism in the first few centuries, 300, 500, and so on. Could you read that first element, Andre, please?
Jesus did not go into retirement for the purpose of fasting and for the affliction of his soul. He was not an ascetic, and he came forever to destroy all such notions regarding the approach to God. He desired to be away for a season of quiet meditation so that he could think out the plans and decide upon the procedures for the prosecution of his public labors in behalf of this world and for all the other worlds in his local universe.
Thank you. I would offer you the first opportunity to react. Do you think that the fact that Jesus went into the wilderness influenced some of the early Christians to believe that asceticism was the answer, depriving oneself, secluding oneself, eating very little, drinking very little? Was this a misinterpretation, even though that was not his intention?
Well, I'm sure it wasn't just him. We certainly have the tradition of John the Baptist, and that's just within that local, focus. There are certainly plenty of others that have engaged in ascetic practices in all religions. Yeah, it's an unfortunate. I mean, my dad, I think picked the confirmation name Jerome, who was a noted hermit in Catholicism, Saint
Yes.
Jerome. And, the fact that you had traditions like that and that these people were sainted, definitely, I mean, you can't blame Jesus for what he did just twice in his life on earth. Once pre-baptismally on Mount Hermon, and then after his baptism, both were done for very clear spiritual purposes. One was getting him to the point of finishing his unification, and the second was post unification, going through the 40 days that we all will go through once we have fused with our thought adjusters. And he effectively would have fused with his thought adjuster had he been a mere mortal like the rest of us. But having looked at that and having that in one's tradition, I still look at the idea of, okay, is there a value to that for the rest of us to pursue, at least in a limited sense? And my own view is that from time to time, it's valuable for us to take time, to take quiet seasons of retreat, so long as they're not overly prolonged, so long as they're not like, forcing us into an attitude of asceticism and moving into becoming a hermit as a way of life. Yeah, that's all I'll say about that.
Thank you, Katharina. I'm going to take advantage of the fact that you are our token female on the panel and being humorous, because you're a lot more than token. But in any case, part of the idea of ascetic was that men should go away and do without women. That a great deal of asceticism had to do with complete lack of any relationship to women for whatever purpose. What do you think this came from? These ideas of complete separation from women?
Well, I think, I put it first in a broader context of the split, the dichotomy between the physical and the transcendent, right? So that anything physical is of the devil if you want to reach God and be near to God. So this other disregard for body, and women bring up desires of the body, and thus, I mean, women had two choices: to be the whore or the prostitute, the prostitute or the saint, like Mary, right? So those were the two options. And I think the whole notion of Jesus separating himself to straighten out, I think the idea of taking time out from the lives that we have created, it's constant input, constant busyness, constant demand from the outer world, I think has tremendous value. I have done several retreats and fastings, and just to create an environment that goes out of the ordinary, to help you create a bridge and then enter maybe the extraordinary. And I mean, back to your question, I think it has to do with how women were perceived, temptresses, evil, unclean, you fill in, unworthy, no soul, and to be dominated. I think that's all part of that form of asceticism, but also I think deeper down, the total disconnect of body to the transcendental. And I think that also fostered the incapacity to understand the kingdom within, because we are in these bodies, we are in these temples, and separating that away from the physical also allowed for God immanent not to exist, but only God eminent. So then also anything eminent of you has the power to tell you what is right, what is wrong, what to do and what not to do.
Thank
So,
you. I'm sorry, did you want to continue a bit? All right.
fine.
Your remarks and the word ascetic, to me, correlate with a trio of problems that were part of my upbringing, like you as a Roman Catholic, that there were three basic evils that a believer had to overcome: the world, the flesh, and the devil. And of course, ascetic correlates with this idea of the flesh, and the world correlates with the idea of separating oneself. And so it seems to me that this concept of asceticism really has not gone away as part of the Christian tradition, and it is still a problem because that is not what Jesus had in mind. All right, now, Bob, I would like to shift yet again, in this case, to the third set of excerpts, A-03, please, and ask you to put that up on the screen. But I'm interested in the two paragraphs at the bottom of the first page of that excerpt, A03.
Okay, 1 second. Here we go. Do I have the page right?
Yes, thank you. The point here I'm trying to reach for is the common preconception that God's favor yields material prosperity. And this is not what Jesus taught. George, would you be willing to read the final two paragraphs on that page? I admit that there is a gap in between them, but please just go ahead and read them if you could. Jesus was not, therefore, a political reformer and economic attitude.
Sure. Jesus was not, therefore, a political reformer. He did not come to reorganize the world. Even if he had done this, it would have been applicable only to that day and generation. Nevertheless, he did show man the best way of living, and no generation is exempt. from the labor of discovering how best to adapt Jesus' life to its own problems. But never make the mistake of identifying Jesus' teachings with any political or economic theory, with any social or industrial system. Economic attitude. Jesus worked, lived, and traded in the world as he found it. He was not an economic reformer, although he did frequently call attention to the injustice of the unequal distribution of wealth. But he did not offer any suggestions by way of remedy. He made it plain to the three that while his apostles were not to hold property, he was not preaching against wealth and property, merely its unequal and unfair distribution. He recognized the need for social justice and industrial fairness, but he offered no rules for their attainment.
Thank you. These two paragraphs, in effect, have a degree of contrast. The first one in the sentence that I highlighted states that we should not make the mistake of identifying Jesus's teachings with any political or economic theory, with any social or industrial system. And then in the second paragraph, it talks about his concern about unequal and unfair distribution of wealth, although he was not preaching against wealth as such. So my question has to do with the role in Christianity of material wealth and the expectation that God will favor his believers by making them prosperous. Andre, would you deal with that?
Well, yes, there's a statement, and I wish I had it clear in my mind exactly where it is, but it really flies in the face of the prosperity gospel. There is no such thing. There's no such evolution of spiritual relationship that confers material benefits as a result of that. And there's a wonderful quote that it's escaping me right now, that isn't speaking, in those terms, but speaks definitively, about Jesus' attitude about that. And but yeah, it's interesting because there's always this idea that shouldn't it be possible for us as human beings to align with spirituality and better our lot here? Shouldn't there be some kind of, isn't that part of justice? And I think what's interesting here is that there definitely is an attitude of Jesus about the unfair distribution of wealth. And it's not associated with a particular system, but rather with the idea of anybody's misuse of any system, is how it strikes me. So that if I would put it in my own terms, it would be, it's not so much that socialism is bad, it's that any kind of misuse of socialism would be bad, either by a poor person taking advantage of that system, unduly, or by the government somehow getting enriched unduly. In the same way, capitalism, no problem with capitalism per se, but an unspiritual capitalism, a capitalism made up of people that only think of themselves, that's certainly not called for. And you wonder how these ideas are tolerated within society. And unfortunately, they become polarized. The actual institutions and the actual ideologies themselves are looked at as problematic when it's really the misuse of ideology and the dominance of ideology. The idea that there could be a cookie cutter solution to solve this problem, and that doesn't involve the transformation of the individual. I think that's really the problem.
Thank you, Bob. I would like to turn to you in terms of interpreting these two paragraphs and specifically whether in effect they amount to an assertion of spirit dominating material and mindal levels. We know that matter, mind, and spirit are the three characteristic elements of finite reality, but the premise that spiritual relationship with God brings wealth, in effect, seems to me to transcend that differentiation and inflict damage against the understanding that these realms, although interdependent, are separate. How would you respond to that, perhaps on a cosmic level?
Ideas versus ideals. I think we're back to the saints issue and the process of pulling spirit down to make material changes. It's the same thing to me, whether it's astrology or the saints or an intercessory priest. What we're trying to, what that particular mental construct does is it completely builds a pattern where that thought pattern works for all issues. I think what these two paragraphs tell me here is that Jesus was dealing with the ideals, dealing at the soul level, dealing with values, dealing with our superconscious mind, which is what we're talking about here. All of this, political, economic, social, industrial system, these are ideas. As Andre brought up, socialism and capitalism, these are ideas of the way to structure society and economics and society, or society-economics, whichever one you want first. So, to me, this is ideas versus ideals. This is the divine counselor who says it is so sad to record that very few Urantians delight in taking the time to be able to think of these cosmic things. I mean, he's really trying to get us to think, look, let's use our superconscious. Let's make a connection with the spiritual experience and the uniformity of insight. And that's how I see these two paragraphs. Over to you.
Thank you, Marvin. I'm going to use the excuse of the fact that you leapfrogged us deep into our future study of monasticism from your own perspective to do the same thing to you from my perspective. I'm going to point out that the Benedictines and then the Cistercians and the Franciscans and the Dominicans all became extremely wealthy, owning great varieties of land, agricultural production. And in effect, they used the spiritual reverence for the teachings of Jesus, or at least the teachings of Christianity, as a vehicle for acquiring comfortable lifestyles and, in effect, living off the benefit of their spiritual authority, even though Jesus's teachings have nothing to do with any social, economic, or political system. Could you please comment on that?
Well, I'm kind of not surprised.
You're not surprised that I asked the question, or you're not surprised that they extracted these privileges?
The second. Would Francis of Assisi see that devolution in what he attempted to inaugurate? He'd be horrified, because he was a true humble person and really tried to emulate his best sense of Jesus' way of life, truly pious, and encouraged other people to live similarly. And I think that's true for many of the founders. And this is a pattern that not only plays out in monasticism, but in institutionalized religion in general, is the founders have a relatively pure vision, and they're attempting to really show people a way forward to relationship with God. And to the extent that things become over institutionalized, they deteriorate. And I always think of this statement, it's in the religion papers and I could find it if you'd like. It's such a singularly clear statement. They talk about the living organism of the spiritual fellowship of the brother, they call it the brother Jesus brotherhood of the kingdom. In modern terms, the living spiritual fellowship of God's family, in my sense, spiritual family. That this is a living organismic reality that transcends every institutional form of affiliation or loyalty. But then they say it may well utilize such institutions, but it must not be supplanted by them. And there is our key. Institutions should be the servants of this higher living reality that unfolds for individuals and unfolds even in the living organism of our relationships that transcends these institutions. That they should be at the service of that, and we need them. What their proper places is functioning to serve the trans-institutional realities.
Thank you. I appreciate that analysis and I agree with the general thrust. I would say that in effect, you've given me an insight that I will now proceed to share, that institutions start with idealists, but very soon thereafter, the profiteers come in. And unfortunately, these are human traits that we will not be able to repeal. But
Well, I think that tendency is not inevitable. It's common, but it's not inevitable. I think if you work hard, you can have institutions that avoid those pitfalls.
I hope so. And I think that it is possible, although the statistics do not work in favor of the proportionality of this. I would congratulate all of you for coming up with very interesting ideas. We have not covered all of the material that I thought we might cover, but I believe that we have nevertheless created a useful introduction to our subsequent consideration in detail of monasticism based on the document containing 48 pages of questions intermixed with background information. And that document has been circulated to you. It is available on the website of the Committee for the Global Endeavor, as I announced at the beginning, immediately underneath the link corresponding to Revelation Revealed. And we will begin with the beginning of our next phase, which will probably resume sometime in October, perhaps mid-October, in considering those detailed questions about monasticism in its different phases. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. This is the last webinar in our current phase, and we will presumably resume after about a month, roughly in the middle of October. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Neil.
Bye. Good to be with you all. Enjoy the end of the summer.
Thank you.